Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. This is the third episode in our series on the state of our national parks. Joining us on this episode are brothers Jon and Destry Jarvis, two giants in the field of conservation and national park management. We will discuss their recent book, National Parks Forever, 50 Years of Fighting and a Case for Independence. Jon Jarvis is a conservationist who served in the United States National Park Service for 40 years, serving from 2009 to 2017 as director, appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Jon began his career as a seasonal interpretive ranger on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Bicentennial. That was a long time ago, 1976. He also served as a protection ranger, resource management specialist, park biologist, and chief of natural and cultural resources. He has served in a number of superintendent positions, including Craters of the Moon, National Monument, Mount Rainier National Park, and Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve. Just prior to becoming NPS director, he served as Pacific West Region director. Jon was the first executive director of the University of California, Berkeley Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity, and now serves as chairman of the board of advisors. His brother, the senior Jarvis, who is with us, has had leadership roles at the National Parks Conservation Association, the Student Conservation Association, National Park Service, National Recreation and Parks Association, and he currently is the vice president of the United States National Committee for the International Council on Monuments and Sites, better known as the World Heritage Program. So welcome to the program, Jon and Destry. Great to have you.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Don. Appreciate being here.
So was there a single moment, and this is for both of you, or occurrence that started your life's journey on this conservation track?
I'll let the senior brother go first.
Well, I'll tell you mine because it's very clear in my mind. When I came back from Vietnam in spring of '72 to Washington, D.C., where my wife was living while I was overseas, there were full-page ads in the Washington Post protesting the clubbing of the baby fur seals in Canada for their white fur. And I spent the next 6 months as a volunteer lobbying Congress with several organizations, Friends of Animals, Fund for Animals, HSUS, for the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that law passed in December of '72. And at that point, I'd been around town long enough and met enough people that I was hired by National Parks and Conservation Association in December of '72 as their legislative affairs specialist.
You know, Destry, I just wanted to comment quickly. I saw those same videos, and I know many other people did too. How did you feel viscerally? I mean, did you cry? Did you get angry? I mean, what was your personal visceral feeling?
Well, I mean, as I said, we had just come back from Vietnam, and there was enough killing there to last a lifetime. But really, I grew up in the outdoors, hunting, fishing, camping, hiking. And so I wasn't adverse to killing wildlife, except these were baby animals that could barely move on the ice. And they were just whacking them in the head with a long stick and then skinning them. And I felt that was inhumane and totally unnecessary to supply white fur for women's coats. And so I reacted viscerally for sure. And it was with anger and not tears. But you know, we shed a few tears after the law passed, and some new protections were put in place.
Understand.
It was an emotional time for sure.
Jon, what about you?
Well, like Destry, I grew up in the outdoors with the same sort of hunting and fishing and enjoying and really thinking about a career path related to conservation in some way. In 1975, I traveled out west and toured around a bunch of the national parks and came back that spring and crashed at Destry's. Started to look for work and was considering going back to grad school at the time. And Destry actually suggested I think about the National Park Service as a career path. As a matter of fact, he was working at NPCA and he handed me the environmental impact statement for the expansion of the airport in the Jackson Hole impacting Grand Teton National Park and asked me to read it and review it for him. And that sort of triggered an interest. And so I applied for a seasonal position on the mall at the Bicentennial Information Center, got that as a GS4 and basically never looked back.
Yeah. So emotionally, could you share with us why you got so attached to national parks? I mean, what's in your human spirit or in your makeup that said, this is something that I believe in and want to dedicate my life to?
Well, I would say because they are the singular category of public lands where preservation comes first. And while it's great to have multiple use on other public lands, there does need to be this category where the intent of Congress, the intent of the presidents of the past has been to have a category of federal public lands where they are preserved in perpetuity in as natural a condition as possible. Obviously, today with climate change and other anthropomorphic impacts, it's not possible to be totally pristine, but you can get very close. And the parks do that. Unlike, as important as the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System is, they are not preservation places for the most part. They are managed use places with conservation as a priority. But I think the parks are intended to be preserved. And, we've, throughout the history of the Park Service, and we talk about this a lot in the book, there's been this tug of war between those who believe the parks are all about tourism and recreation and the dollars that the concessionaires can make, and those that believe preservation has to come first, and everything else must be balanced against that. So,
I think what I was getting at, and I understand that, and that's the practical result of the beauty and importance of parks. But for instance, I'll use myself as an example. I mean, as a 5-year-old standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon when we immigrated or migrated, whatever the word is, from Louisiana, I mean, I was gobsmacked. And when I first visited Yosemite as a 6-year-old and they were still doing the firefalls, pushing, the campfire over the falls there at the top of El Capitan. I mean, I'll never forget it. Years later, I met Bill Lane, who was one of the rangers back in the 50s, who was responsible for doing that, actively involved. And so I was just wondering, in your personal experiences, did you have that, oh my God, these treasures have to be maintained? It does something to your brain, establishes a sense of wonder and awe that kind of never leaves you. So that's what I was getting at. Did you have that kind of experience in parks as you decided to dedicate your life to this?
Well, for me, it was also the Grand Canyon at dawn, sitting on the rim of the canyon in total blackness, where there are no intruding human-made lights, and sitting there until the sun comes up is just transformative. It's an emotional surge, seeing that vastness, that beauty, that range of colors was that kind of transcending experience for me.
Yeah. What about you, John?
Yeah, I think that mine is more specifically related to being out in nature as a young person. We didn't have the money to travel, so we really never, neither Destry or I, ever experienced the national parks other than perhaps Shenandoah Parkway, which is nearby where we grew up. We grew up with our property backing up to national forest lands. And, our dad taught us to go into the woods and sit and be quiet and let nature sort of come out. And for me, that was always a wondrous experience, to be immersed in nature in a way that you become sort of part of it. And I think then later discovering the national parks as the sort of epitome of that opportunity, a place that where nature has been already preserved, and that the public are invited in to experience that. And I think some of the, we have all had these transformative experiences in these places that are just absolutely unforgettable. And I think about that from that we have, as a nation, set aside these places specifically to allow for that kind of experience that cannot be found anywhere else. And I think that aligned with my own personal values to say this is a place I could invest my career, my time, my energy in preserving.
Yeah, well, I bring it up because the three of us have testified before Congress, state legislatures, local legislatures, most of our lives. And when we're sitting there, sometimes you get bogged down in the weeds of the details of money and a lack of money, lack of resources, the political battles that you fight. And we sometimes forget to communicate why these things are important and what they do to us as human beings. And I wanted to start off with that foundation and framework so our listeners understand, look, we're not just talking about getting money for an agency for the sake of getting money or complaining about the lack of funding because this is our pet, project, but these things have a deep meaning for us all. And I know you all understand that, and that really came through in your book. But to get to one of the hard questions about funding, you both emphasized in your book, of course, how long you've worked in conservation and national parks. And during that time, there's been a constant drumbeat that parks are underfunded. So why haven't efforts to adequately fund parks been successful? Why do we come back every year with the same old problem? I mean, that kind of drives me crazy, to tell you the truth.
I'll start this one, Destry, you jump in. Having testified before Congress every year in the appropriations cycle as director, but also participated in the budget formulation process with the administration, I know firsthand what a challenge this is, both in terms of the needs, but the challenge of accomplishing an adequate appropriation for the National Park Service. And to me, there's two elements that are really critical. One is, and this we articulate in the book, is that in the budget formulation process, the National Park Service is part of the Department of the Interior. And the allocation by the president to the Department of Interior comes from O&B, the Office of Management and Budget. And they put a cap on it. And they say, this is all you get. And the secretary has to divide that up amongst her children, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, Indian Affairs. And we literally sit around a table at least in non-hostile administrations and discuss this. And literally, I'm arguing for more rangers to patrol Yosemite, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, well, if we don't have more officers, then the children are going to starve on the reservation. or there's going to be a higher incidence of violence on the reservation, or the Fish and Wildlife Service says, you know, this particular endangered species is probably going to wink out during your tenure. And so we're all arguing for little pieces of a limited pie. And the Park Service gets the most already. They're the largest budget item in the Department of Interior. And so when you go in to argue you want more, that means less for the others. And then, you know, then you got to go, you know, deal with the priorities of the, you know, you make that argument, and then you go to Congress and they get an allocation, you know, that is coming down from full appropriations to the subcommittees, and they have to make a decision that, you know, how much goes to the Smithsonian, to the National Archives, to the U.S. Forest Service, and then to Interior, and then the National Park Service. And so it's a zero-sum game, and fundamentally, you're looking at a perpetuity organization on an annual appropriation. You have an agency that works 365 days of the year, 24 hours a day, operating parks. It's an operational agency, and it gets an annual budget. And now, even worse, we don't even get the budget until, you know, here we are. They passed the Park Service budget, what, 2 weeks ago? This is March. You know, we're halfway into our year, and could do no planning and no, you know, hiring and all of those kinds of things without a budget. And so it's a mess. Destry, you've been through this too.
Add a little bit of politics to this. This process has changed dramatically since the early 70s. One of the reforms President Nixon instituted was to change the Bureau of the Budget in the White House to the Office of Management and Budget. And for the first time, giving the White House direct management control over the bureaus. In doing so, he ordered each bureau to establish an assistant secretary, in this case, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, with line authority over the agencies under it, rather than simply being advisory or assistants to the secretary. So they had direct responsibility. And it's also good to remember that OMB, in this new power it had, establishes the number of FTE, full-time equivalent employees, that an agency may have. You know, it doesn't matter what Congress appropriates. If they don't have the FTE, they may have to contract out, or they use volunteers or whatever, but they don't have the employees that they believe they need to properly manage the parks. And those changes that took place beginning in the 70s have had material effects right up to today. You know, there was a time when, even in my professional experience, when the director of the Park Service could go right to the secretary on an as needed basis and say, I need this, I want your support for that. Now there are at least 9 layers of political appointees between the director of the Park Service and the secretary. And each one of them can essentially block or veto whatever it is the professional opinion of the Park Service is. And so many times the secretary never gets to hear what the real need is from the professional point of view of the Park Service. Now, not that that professional view is going to maintain all the time, but we want to get to a place where the director of the Park Service can express that professional view directly to the secretary, to the Congress, and to the public. This is what the parks need to be maintained, to be used, to be preserved. And if they can't do that, they'll never have enough.
Understood. It's interesting that you talked about the level of bureaucracy that's in these agencies. That was the one thing that, believe it or not, was the most frustrating for me as a political appointee. I don't know how you felt about it, Destry, also as a political appointee in the Clinton administration, but I was appalled. I mean, and our listeners need to understand that part of the problem with budgeting and funding just has to do with the levels of bureaucracy, and you mentioned 9 levels like that. Frankly, most of the time I was there, I was embarrassed to be a political appointee because there were so many of them. And I was like, what the hell is this? Why, this doesn't make any sense. And it does frustrate the ability to manage and to budget appropriately in parks. So I quite understand what you're saying from personal experience. And one of the reasons I wanted you on the program is so our listeners could get a deeper understanding, be it down in the weeds or not, about how this process works and why this cyclical problem of budgeting for the National Park Service. Because I believe the more the public is educated about the process, the better, and perhaps in the future something can be done about it. So let's go on. I think you know that there was a recent report that appeared in a prominent national magazine, Parks Magazine. I think you guys were on its program a year ago with Kurt talking about your new book. But in the magazine, it reported a report actually from Peer that continued to talk about the low morale in the National Park Service, the lack of funding, and went through a whole gamut. It even showed a ranking of the National Park Service is fairly low amongst government agencies. So, John, in your book, you make it clear that as director, you were very much aware of that, and you attempted to tackle this problem. And so, my question is: have there really been successes, and do you even agree with this report?
You're right that I spent a lot of time trying to understand the results of the best places to work analysis. And, what's reported in the press is kind of the summary of that report, but there's actually quite a bit of detail behind it. And you can sort of dive down into the data to better understand really what's going on. And there's really a couple of key factors. One is that within the same survey, there's a very high correlation between the employee of the National Park Service's value set and the mission of the agency. That's at one of the highest in the government. But then there's a very low score of their ability to accomplish that mission. Mm-hmm. And so what the net morale measures is disappointment. Mm-hmm. Our employees are disappointed in their ability to accomplish their jobs due to lack of money, mm-hmm. the infusion of politics in the agency, poor leadership and poor supervision, people that will not be courageous enough to stand up and push back on the bad ideas that come forward. And all of those affect morale. Now, the data is unit by unit, so you can actually look at the morale of the employees of the Grand Canyon versus that of Yosemite or Yellowstone or Grand Portage. And there is great variability, which means that in some locations, they are achieving their goals and the morale is fairly high. What you get is when you lump all that together, you get an average that shows the entire agency is at pretty low level. So what we were spending time on is looking as to what is going on in those parks or units that are scoring high, and then begin to use that information to better improve those that are scoring quite low. But it's a tough problem. But I think some of the things that Destry and I have suggested in terms of independence, better funding, more consistent funding, funding over multiple years, all of those could help the employee accomplish their mission and significantly improve their morale.
Yeah. I kind of have a corollary to that question too. I mean, there are resource rangers, there are protection rangers, there are interpretive rangers. We don't talk about maintenance as much as we should. They're maintenance workers. And all of these people have their particular focus in helping the National Park Service achieve its mission. When you have limited resources, you know, do you sometimes get a situation where those disparate disciplines within the National Park Service end up getting pitted against each other? The resource ranger wants, you know, more funding for their programs. The interpretive ranger's not getting enough money. Or if the patrol ranger sees money going to one area, they get jealous, and you end up, you know, with a situation where employees end up being pitted against each other. Does that contribute to the morale? What did you find there, if anything?
For sure. I can actually tell you a perfect example. When I went to become the superintendent of Mount Rainier National Park, in my first meeting of the senior staff, which would have included the chief of maintenance, the chief of interpretation, the chief ranger, the resource specialist, there was the discussion about refilling a position. And the debate was, do we hire essentially a plumber for the maintenance division or an interpreter for the interpretive division? And in the middle of the meeting, the chief of maintenance, who could have easily been a linebacker in a pro football, is yelling at the top of his lungs, standing up, yelling, and the chief of interpretation is crying. And I was asked to, I turned to one of the folks and said, "Is it always like this in here?" And they said, "Yep, that's pretty much it. This is what you get." And yeah, that is a relatively common challenge, because the money comes down to the parks essentially as a block grant, and then the park superintendent has to make decisions with limited resources about what are the priorities. And some of that is dependent on, you know, the state of that particular park and its needs at the time. Whether it's maybe getting excessive visitation, or it's in a development phase, or whatever. And they can literally make a decision to say, this division gets the money this year, next year you'll get your turn. And that creates tension, no question.
Well, and of course, I brought it up because I want our viewers and listeners and people that have heard about these reports and low morale and that sort of thing to understand that many times there are root causes of this. It's not because there are bad people in the National Park Service and they just don't like each other, or there are inherent, you know, conflicts, but they have root causes, and a lot of the causes, you know, just have to do with competition for limited resources. Destry, I thought you were going to say something there.
I would just add a couple of other factors. You know, there's a constant stream of additions to the national park system. It varies widely from administration to administration, but every time a new unit is added, that adds a budgetary cost that has to come from somewhere. And if Congress doesn't increase the appropriation to cover it, it has to come out of the hide of existing units of the park system. Now, one of the truisms is the older the park, the bigger its budget. I think is true across the Park Service, because they've been around long enough to accumulate this ONPS account, the operations budget. And new parks don't have that luxury, but they have to have some money to operate, and the money has to come from somewhere, or they can't open the park. And there's constant pressure to get the park open, because usually there is one or more members of Congress and the Senate who have been the principal sponsors of getting that place in the national park system. And they want it funded and open as soon as possible. So the money has to come from somewhere, and it rarely comes from an increase in the budget specifically for that. So that's a constant struggle at the upper levels of the Park Service to figure out how to get the new places open and how to keep the rest of the system functioning at a manageable level where they can.
Well, how much of that problem, though, can you lay at the feet of some NGOs, environmental groups that may champion the addition of new lands to the National Park Service and some new members of Congress who then turn their backs on the need for funding and for increasing the budget.
Yeah, there is a clear line of demarcation in the Congress and in their process between authorization and appropriation. It's done by different committees. Those committees rarely talk to each other. And certainly never, the authorizing committees don't talk to the appropriators before they authorize a new park. There can be all kinds of instigators or innovators or pushers for new units. It doesn't necessarily start with a member. It often starts with the community, the mayor of a town or a governor of a state or an NGO may be advocating for a new unit. And then the members of Congress push it through, or in some cases, the president uses the Antiquities Act to proclaim a national monument. And that has the same effect. It adds a budgetary demand without a concomitant appropriation that has to come later, sometimes several years later, to get it going. So there is this glitch in the system, if you will, that gets areas authorized well before they're funded. And it used to be that the Park Service had a formal professional study process in which it initiates the studies and makes reports to Congress, and Congress acts on those studies. That has sort of gone out the window. And rarely does the Park Service initiate a study of a new place. It's usually dictated by Congress through a study authorization. And sometimes the Park Service can say, no, we don't think this place is qualified. But that doesn't necessarily determine what the Congress is going to do. Quite often they'll go ahead and authorize a place that they have to be obligated to manage at the same standard as every other unit in the system.
Don, before you leave the budget question, I just want to make a comment for your listeners that one is that the 1/10, a little less than 1/10 of 1 cent of your tax dollars go to support the National Park Service. So that's, it's what Congress the appropriators would call decimal dust. It's a very, very small amount of money. And the second part is that the data shows that an investment in the National Park Service has a monetary return to the U.S. economy at $4 to $1 in the local economy and $10 across the nation. So making the economic argument to our appropriators is one of the keys to getting them to invest appropriately in the service.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate those statistics. And of course, when you tell people that the U.S. government has a multi-trillion-dollar budget in the first place, I mean, that's incomprehensible.
Right.
I mean, everybody thinks they know what $1 million, $1 billion, and then we go from $1 billion to $1 trillion. It's not hyperbole to say that it's incomprehensible. I mean, most people don't have any idea what that means. Yeah. So, Destry, I wanted to ask you about the Great American Outdoors Act and what impact its passage has had on funding for the National Park Service. I think we all know that that was a monumental occurrence, even during COVID, to get that passed. I had been working on this for, I don't know, it seems like my entire lifetime, going back to the 90s when we first tried to get the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent and reauthorized. And you made a point in your book about how long this process often takes. And so finally we got this act passed. And I'm just wondering about what the impacts have been so far. What have you seen as a result of the passage of that act? And maybe you can explain for our listeners what that is.
Sure. let me step back a bit and note that this wasn't the first time that Congress and the Park Service and administrations have sought additional money for maintenance and operations of the parks.
Yeah.
You know, you go back to Mission 66, which was a 10-year initiative started by the Eisenhower administration, finished in the Johnson administration, that would bring the parks up to standard through additional money appropriated directly from Congress for maintenance of facilities and services to the public, and some resources. In 81, when Jim Watt was secretary, he announced the Park Restoration and Improvement Program, which was intended as another infusion of new money for maintenance of facilities and services. Congress appropriated some significant amount of money in those years. But it was never the amount that was needed. During, I think it was even during your term in Washington, Don, that they developed a method of assessing at the park level what the facility condition was,
Index.
setting priorities based on significance of those resources, and putting those two value criteria together, you could determine a ranking of what's important to fix in some sort of order. And that was a good thing. It just was never enough money to get to the bottom of the list, or even the halfway down the list, because the system had grown, the costs went up, and while it was a good chunk of money that was added, it never was enough. So what Congress did in earlier in the 2020s was pass this Great American Outdoors Act that did two separate things. One was to, for the first time, tap onshore leasing receipts of federal resources on, not on parks, but on BLM principally lands, to go into a fund that could then be appropriated, written as sort of an automatic appropriation. It was available immediately, and then Congress had to allocate it for facilities, services, maintenance in the parks, and other agencies too, although National Park Service got the biggest portion of that. It also created, as you had talked about doing earlier, a permanent appropriation for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Land and Water Conservation Fund, since the 60s, was tapping Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas leasing receipts for projects under LWCF, which are mostly either grants to the states for conservation and recreation, or direct land acquisition by the 4 federal public land agencies. Again, with the Park Service generally getting the biggest portion of that. What has gone on in the years that it's been operational is a lot of money going to maintenance in the Park Service, a lot of projects being accomplished. In the middle of that process, the Park Service changed the criteria, moved the goalpost, let's put it that way. And I think it was ill conceived, because it went, the supposed backlog of maintenance requirements went from about 12 billion to $20 billion of maintenance needs, simply by saying that we're going to assess the condition of every facility and value it as if it were essentially a new construction, or to bring an existing facility up to the standard of a new construction. So without adding a project, they up the amount of the backlog. And you can make an argument that they really needed to know what the actual cost of recovering everything is. But that assumes that there's going to be a national disaster and everything's going to get wiped out all at once, and you need to fix it all at once. That has never been the case, and never will be the case, barring Yellowstone erupting. But we've always been able to parse the amounts needed in a priority setting system. That your criteria, I think they were when you were there, established asset priorities, condition and priorities. And I thought that worked quite well if the money was there. Now, the AGO Act provides some additional money, but when that bigger number hit the newspapers and the media, it blew up in the Park Service's face, and Congress basically said, we're not going to deal with you anymore on this stuff. You know, it's just, it was at best, it was a bad PR move.
So has the end result been that that there hasn't been as much money funneled to the maintenance backlog as necessary, or has it been pulled altogether?
Well, it was never going to be as much as necessary, but it was a lot more than it had been. And the money continues to flow as essentially an automatic appropriation for the 5-year period that the AGO was authorized for. And there's some hope, some campaign, some expectation that Congress will extend that. You know, the people that like leasing oil and gas or coal or other reserves on the public lands like it because they can say, look what this leasing is doing in addition to energy independence, what it's doing for the improvement of the national parks and the wildlife refuges and so forth. So there's been support from them for this program as well as, you know, the conservationists and so forth.
So John, has it resulted in increased funds available for that? It is the American Great Outdoors Act. Has it resulted in an increase in funds for federal land acquisition and other management priorities for national parks?
Well, two things. One is the Infrastructure Act also provided some additional funds for maintenance backlog. So I do believe that many of the most serious problems in the park systems maintenance are being addressed. A lot of life safety, water, sewage kinds of systems. Nothing sexy, but really essential kind of core things are being done throughout the system, and that's great. The other thing that this is a little bit down in the weeds, but with the LWCF no longer subject to appropriations, we were not caught in this situation where we were in the Obama administration, where the administration put LWCF as a priority, but it was subject to appropriation. So we would put it in our budget at X amount of money. It would go to Congress and they would zero it out. And then we had already provided the cuts because we had to absorb the LWCF side. And then they just implemented that. And so time and time again, we kept cutting our own budget because we were having to incorporate LWCF, which was not going to get appropriated, or certainly not at the level we requested. So now the LWCF appropriations predominantly is going to the states. There's the swing amount is being offered on things like forest legacy and the state allocations, which is not bad. I don't want to argue against that, but there hasn't really been a significant increase in the federal acquisition. It's still sort of hovering around where it has been, I think, historically in the 50 to 70 million kind of class. And again, that's to pick up priority in holdings.
I would add to that, Don, that within this administration, the Biden administration, the Park Service has moved from being the top dog to the bottom dog among the public land agencies. Particularly of land and water conservation fund monies. Because the Park Service itself adopted this attitude that, well, every acre we buy is going to have to be maintained in the future, and that's going to add to the backlog. And so they've been very reluctant to support new land acquisition. And on the flip side of that, the Interior Department is really high on this campaign that's started with Bruce Babbitt in the Clinton administration to make BLM into a conservation agency. So BLM has been getting a much larger share of LWCF money than they ever have.
Mhm.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not going to the national parks.
Under-
And
Understand.
one of the areas where the Park Service has an appropriate need for more land acquisition are in the long distance trails. The intent of Congress when they established the National Scenic Trails and the National Historic Trails was that land along those trails be protected. And they're not getting nearly the money that they need.
Understand. Well, the fortunate thing with the national parks, or one of the positive things I think we can talk about, if you don't mind, are park partnerships, and particularly with friends groups and the National Parks Foundation providing private funding for parks, and that's been important for parks for a very long time. And some of these friends groups, of course, raise millions of dollars. They build visitor centers and interpretive centers. They provide money for trails. Yet sometimes there seems there's still criticism of the partnership concept. What's been your take over the years on park partnerships and friends groups? Has it been positive or negative or just neutral for the most part?
I'll take that one first. I'm a big fan of partnerships, and particularly with our friends groups that have been essentially essential to the support for a lot of programs in parks that have not been funded through the federal appropriations process or through fee programs as well. And when you look generally across the system, I would mark them definitely in the positive column. Occasionally, there are issues that we have to go in and sort of resolve a conflict between the park's superintendent and a friends organization as well. Increasingly, some of our parks are kind of a blend of partnership and park operations, where there's even some operations run by the friends organization or by a partner organization, and that's fine too. That sort of works. I will say one of the big challenges that I faced with partnerships and parks was with the Department of the Interior Solicitor's Office, who really are there in their own minds to protect the federal government, and they often impose all risk on the partner, rather than accepting some risk on the part of the agency to the relationship. And that when all the risk is on the partner and the agency is risk-free, that's not a partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to battle repeatedly with them over trying to basically understand the mechanics of how this is to work on the ground, about how projects are identified, how they're executed, and while at the same time meet all the legal standards, we need better support with our legal staff on how these partnerships are to work.
I understand. Any comments on that, Destry?
I would say, I've spent most of my career, except the 8 years of the Clinton administration, on the NGO side, and worked a lot with and for, in my last 20 years as a consultant, a lot of these partner organizations. And so I think they perform an essential service. And we used to say that when they're funding organizations, that they're providing a measure of excellence above what the standard appropriation could cover. In more recent times, some of them, particularly the National Park Foundation itself, has taken on bigger responsibilities, like this recent announcement of $40 million investment in housing for Yellowstone. I think that's singular and a departure from what has been thought was appropriate for the private sector to do versus what the Congress should appropriate the money for. But they weren't getting the money from Congress. So the foundation said, we're going to go ahead and do it because there is some desperation of the condition, and employees of the Park Service were forced to live in pretty shabby conditions in the parks, particularly in the parks that are far from urban centers.
Absolutely.
urban units of the park system, people mostly live on the local economy. They don't live in park housing, but in the remote places, they live in park housing.
Right.
And it's an essential ingredient for those units of the system. But generally,
Well, we're gonna.
have been great, and there should be more of them, not less of them.
I agree. Well, I hope we don't run out of time before we get a chance to talk about the most important aspect of your book, and that's your important proposal to make the National Park Service an independent agency. So how do you think that will work? I've listened to you talk about this on other programs, and of course I've read about it in your book, and you have a beautiful summary, and as a matter of fact, in the back of your book, at the end of your book, laying out how this could possibly work and how it should work. But really, how realistic is it for the National Park Service to become an independent agency like the Smithsonian? And aren't you still going to have the political vicissitudes that exist currently?
Well, I would just say to that point in particular, the first thing we need is the ability of the Park Service professional director and staff to be able to say what they think is important publicly.
Mm-hmm.
They can't do that now.
Mm-hmm.
And haven't been able to for many years. I think when George Hartzog was director, he was the last director to be able to file his own report to Congress on a pending piece of legislation that was separate from the Department of the Interior or the White House view on that same legislation. And that doesn't mean it's what happens, but it means the integrity of the service is upheld by the professional views of the agency. And that's an important thing in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the one time when Congress, in the late 80s, Congress got very close held oversight hearings on the idea of independence. And they were looking to create the director job as a appointed position, still appointed by the president, but with a term that expanded or extended beyond the term of the president. So as the Smithsonian is, whether I forget if it's 8 years or 10 years or some period of time, obviously it can be removed for malfeasance. But in the case of, when President Nixon fired George Hartzog and replaced him with a member of his campaign advance team, the Park Service suffered for a number of years for lack of leadership. That campaign appointee, I sat in the audience at his first hearing on the Hill, and the chair of the committee asked him a question about Yosemite, and he turned to the Park Service guy next to him on the table and said, "What state is that in?" And it was, it was an embarrassment from then on.
Right.
So,
yeah, I think, my feeling is that you have to plant the seeds for a political change. And that's kind of what Destry and I have done with the book. The timing obviously would have to be right for the Congress to be willing to hold some hearings, as they did back when Bruce Vento was there. We would need some champions on the Hill, and we would need leadership within an administration that's willing to, quote unquote, let it go, because in many ways, the Park Service is kind of the plaything of the secretary. If they want a photo op, they don't do it, in front of a cattle ranch. They do it in the Grand Canyon, and so giving up the Park Service will be a struggle, frankly, for a lot of reasons. It will not free the Park Service from politics, but it solves a number of the problems that we've already discussed about the morale of the agency, the funding process, their willingness to justify for new units or against new units. All of those kinds of things could significantly improve And the way I look at it is, if you look at the Smithsonian, they have a mission. They basically tell the American story, both the natural history and cultural history, through all of the items that they have within their museums, within their collections. We have the places. We actually have the physical site where history happened, or where natural history carried on its current biodiversity. And they're functional equivalents. Ones are a little more complicated in my mind, because they're big and they're vast and they're all over the country. And so if you're going to invest in those places and stories to be managed in perpetuity, then it needs an independence. It needs a freedom to be able to accomplish that mission for the American people.
So, Destry, this was my question I mentioned to you earlier as we were chatting before we got started, and it has to do with the fact that, you've mentioned, and Jon just mentioned again, you're going to need broad political support and broad public support. You don't have the same champions in Congress that you used to have. So might this effort involve putting together a political action committee and recruiting candidates for Congress who are going to be supporters of this kind of idea and supporters of conservation and preservation in general? I really haven't heard of a political action committee that focuses on that other than the NGOs that work on these problems ostensibly.
Yeah.
And
even with the League of Conservation Voters, they rarely have, a public land issue or a national park issue as one of the things that they rate members of Congress on. And it's been a number of decades now, really, since there were leaders in important positions, National Park Subcommittee or the Senate Natural Resource Committee, that put national parks as a high priority for their legislative agenda. So yeah, we need to grow our own, and there is no political action committee that's pursuing that specific course, to my knowledge.
I know we're going to run out of time here soon. We've got a few minutes left, but Jon, is that something that the University of California at Berkeley Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity could work on? Is specifically what impact has the Institute had on national parks that didn't exist before, and is a political action committee something that it could get involved in?
I don't think that would be appropriate for the Institute. I think that all the challenges of being at a university and its aversion to, even if it is Berkeley, to political action. I think we're more focused on the bringing the best science to the management of parks and protected areas, and really driving new information into the hands of the decision makers, and creating new science that could be applied to parks and protected areas, not only in the National Park Service, but around the world. That's where kind of our focus has been.
Understand.
You need a window.
Go ahead,
of
Destry.
need a window of opportunity where the stars align, where the politicians align in key places. You need a president who would be sympathetic, like Jimmy Carter was with his Department of Natural Resources. You need a secretary who understands and might want to get rid of this problem agency. And particularly, you need members of Congress like Bruce Vento was, like Dale Bumpers was, like Phil Burton was. But those guys are gone. And we need to make some significant political effort to find their successors in another generation.
Right. So have you tried to plant the seed in some future leaders? I know you've got Governor Newsom, who might run for president one day. You've got his Secretary of Resources, Mr. Crowfoot, who's been on my program before, who might be amenable to these kinds of ideas. Have you ever run these ideas past them or members of their staff at all?
No, not specifically. I have not that group. Destry and I did do a Hill visit soon after our book was published. Stopped by, talked to Senator Angus King, who is an independent, but he's very much of a park supporter, and gave him a copy of the book and suggested he hold a hearing at some point. We stopped by, talked to some of the staff in park subcommittees, and just sort of planting the seeds. Obviously, the timing is not good now, but I think over time we could build the support.
Understand. Well, we always conclude life is a story we tell ourselves with this question, and it's for both of you. Can you share with our listeners a transcendent moment in your individual lives that may have changed you forever, or changed your outlook in a global or universal sense?
I'll start. Let the senior Jarvis bat last. So in 1982, I went to Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas as for Holy, the Bean Ranger, District Ranger. And I was contacted by a group called Paraplegics on Independent Nature Trips, or POINT. And they were coming to the park to climb Guadalupe Peak, highest point in Texas, in their wheelchairs. And make a long story short, the 5 of them started, 3 of them succeeded over 5 days in climbing the mountain, which I assisted as the ranger. That was my district. But one day during, they had a ground team in our campground that were also all in wheelchairs. And one of them hopped out of his chair and said, "Get in my chair and I'll give you a tour of your campground." And so I got in a wheelchair and off we went through the campground. And it was a life-changing experience to understand the barriers that we create to people that have different abilities. And it definitely has influenced my direction around the American Disabilities Act, and to meet the intent, not just the letter, for providing accessibility to our national parks across the system.
Right. Well, I can vouch for that because I know you worked on many of those issues when I was in Washington, even with the hearing impaired. I know we worked together on some of those issues, and I know you're dedicated to that, and that's made a tremendous a tremendous impact and difference in the lives of the disabled. I really appreciate you telling that story. Destry?
Well, I mean, I've had a lot of transcendent experiences in national parks. In the middle 80s, I put a canoe trip in the Everglades together for 5 couples. The other 4 couples were all Hill staff and their spouses. And we paddled through the swamp for 5 or 6 days, camping on beaches at night. And that was an experience that sort of transcended, ones that I had had before, because you get out of the canoe and you slog through the slough, as they call it, water up to your chest. You can see, we went through one passage where the water level was below the bank by several feet, and the banks were lined with alligators, and they would slide off into the water and scrape their backs on the bottom of the canoe as you went by. That gave my wife a thrill in particular.
I bet.
Yeah, I think she's never forgiven you, if I remember right.
And I think those kinds of experiences, and I've had them, all over. I've been 3 times down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. I've been to Embryo Lake at the source of the Noatak River in the far Arctic. And they're just incomparable experiences. But I will also say, not to just follow on what Brother John has done, but when I worked for Secretary Babbitt, he put me in charge of what was then a regulatory negotiation through the Federal Access Board for establishing ADA compliance with outdoor developed areas, to write the code, but write the regulations. And of course, many of the other people involved were paraplegic. There were in wheelchairs, including most of the leadership of the Federal Access Board. And I got to know them quite well. And one of them, who was a Vietnam veteran like myself and who was limited to a wheelchair, but was still a pilot. We flew all over the Chesapeake Bay one day with him. I came away with that being much more open to the idea that it's a responsibility of the agencies and the advocates to assure that there is access places, not necessarily every place by every means, but there are ways to do it so that there is universal access. And I too, like John, am committed to assuring that those options are available for people wherever we can. In my particular case, I was interested in trails, and the Appalachian Trail in particular was on the table, as you know, how can we make the AT for its 190 miles accessible for people in wheelchairs? And the answer was, you can't do it everywhere, but you can do a lot of it. And I think there have been those improvements made over the years. So that there's more opportunity for everybody.
Well, on behalf of my listeners and the American people, I want to thank both of you for your tremendous contribution and service to national parks, and not just national parks, to conservation in general. I know you guys have been dedicated and committed public service. Thank you, Jon and Destry, for joining me on Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves.
Thank you, Don, as well. Thank you for your service.
Thank you all for joining us on this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. In our next episode, we'll continue the discussion on national parks with Will Shafroth, who is the president of the National Parks Foundation. In the meantime, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.